have you been hearing about the term passive house? And you're wondering, okay, is that the same as passive solar? Or is that maybe you know that it's some kind of a standard? And how does that compare to LEED or Energy Star? Like, is your head about to explode? Well, if that's the case, then you're in the right place, because in today's video, we're going to be talking with Mariana Pickering of EMU here in Colorado. And Mariana is going to walk us through what actually is a passive house, what it isn't, how it's different than some of those other rating systems, and the kind of the how and the why of why you would want to do this and how you would actually build a passive house, and the rebates that are out there, especially for those who were victims of the Marshall Fire in Colorado. So before we dive into that, I just want to say hi, Mariana, and thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
All right. So before we talk about passive house, I'm just really curious to know, how did you get into this? I saw in your bio something about a recovering architect, which I think is funny because I always call myself a recovering engineer. So I guess there's a bunch of us out there that are recovering. So can you give us a little background about how you got to be doing this work with EMU, the company that you co-founded?
Yeah, so yeah, it's funny. I think everyone in the passive house world has really interesting paths as to how we got here down this really deep building science rabbit hole that we're in. So my educational background was architectural design. I went to WashU in St. Louis, and then I did a master's at the University of Sydney for sustainable design. And Enrico, my co-founder, and I started first as an architecture firm in Italy, in his hometown, in about 2009. And for about 8 years, we were kind of a small architecture studio, really wanting to focus as much as we could on sustainability. And whatever form that meant changed a lot for us over the years. And being as close as we were to Germany, where a lot of the passive house research is coming out of, and Enrico spoke German fluently, and so we were able to kind of access a lot of that research. We found the passive house standard kind of early on in our journey as architects, and we just fell in love with it as a benchmark because it's the only kind of line in the sand that we could draw and point to and have accountability on as far as trying to hit a performance metric. So I kind of came into the building science world actually from the design side. Enrico's background is much more on the engineering and building science side of it, and I manage kind of our training program now, and I run the company and do a lot of our marketing communications. I help folks kind of unpack what is passive house and what does that mean, and how can I, translate the building science geekiness.
I think that's where the power is. It's interesting too that there's a lot of women do that role,
Mm.
as those kind of translators from the technical whatever to the lay person that couldn't care less about a lot of those details, but just wants the end result. And so being someone that is a good communicator, not talking down or whatever, but really getting to the heart of it. So with that, so what is passive house?
Yes, great question. So the way I like to describe it is that it's like a building code. So think less like LEED, where you've got a checklist of things that you're trying to check off in order to get points towards something. It's not really like that. It's like a building code in the fact that it's performance metric based. So you model. It's based on modeling early on in the process once you've got a good concept design, and kind of simulating and guessing how that building is going to perform in the future. And because it's so dependent on precise modeling, it has a very low performance gap, which is something that green building looks at a lot in general for all of these different kinds of certification schemes. It's what is the actual gap between how this building is expected to perform versus how it actually performs. And passive house has an extremely low performance gap because it's based on a lot of performance metrics early on in the modeling and the design process.
And that is fascinating stuff because I was working on the first Colorado home energy rating system 30
Mhm.
years ago. And yeah, that's a big deal is the energy modeling and then the actual
Mhm.
usage. And there's a lot that goes into that.
Mhm.
Um, and so before we talk about kind of the process of how one would create a passive house and all the integrated design and the performance testing and all those pieces, what are some of the common parts of a passive house? If someone's just trying to imagine it, what are some of the features that are part of a passive house?
Yeah. So one of the things we use in our training for, we do accredited training for builders, the Certified Passive House Tradesperson course. And one of the devices I like to use is mnemonics. And we had a very fun student one time who came up with a mnemonic for us that I like to repeat for the 5 principles of passive house. And it's that passive house is SMART. S for super insulated, M for mechanical ventilation, A for air tightness, R for really good windows. That one's stretching it a little. And then T for thermal bridge free. So those 5 things are kind of the pillars of what the performance metric is looking at. And there's a lot more that goes into each of those, but those are the 5 things that you'll typically hear people talking about when they talk about passive house principles.
I love that. I love that mnemonic. Okay, so it was SMART, so super insulated envelope, M for mechanical ventilation, A for air tightness, R for really good
Really good windows.
windows.
If you have a better one, let me know.
I love it. And then T was about the thermal bridging.
Yep, thermal bridge free or mitigated. So, I can go into details on each of these, but you're
Right.
never going to have a completely thermal bridge free building, but you want to have all of your thermal bridges mitigated.
That's kind of the goal. And so those are the features. And like with marketing, we talk about like the features and the benefit, so you get like a really fast computer, but like, why do you care?
Right.
So it's, so always like, what is the benefit of that thing? So as you're thinking of those different features of a passive house, why are those things important? What does that actually give somebody? That's
Yeah. So I
different
think,
from a regular house, I guess.
yeah, I think there's been a misunderstanding about passive house in general over the decades that it's been around, in that one of the results, which is excellent, is drastically improved energy efficiency. And I mean drastically, like 90% over conventional builds. And that's fantastic. But I think you'll find, especially in the United States, in warmer climates, the energy efficiency argument is not necessarily something that matters a ton to everyone for whatever reasons. The things that passive house results in, and that those principles that we talked about really have an impact on, are things that I think are a lot more important when we think about buildings, because we have to remember that buildings are for people. We live in these buildings. We I often kind of joke that I thought I was an environmentalist for a long time, but I'm not, because the planet doesn't need buildings. We don't need to be building for the planet. In order to stay on the planet, we need to be building buildings that allow us to live in harmony with it. And a lot of that is creating shelter that is healthy and safe for us. And the healthy and safe and durable, those are the things that Passive House really excels at. So when you start implementing these measures to this performance metric, you're really looking at more durable construction, healthier and safer for the occupant. And a lot of that is represented in the indoor environmental quality, both the air quality. The Passive House standard is the only one that requires continuous fresh air exchange. And I think we're very used to being in bad buildings. We're used to living in buildings that are uncomfortable, where you sit next to the window and you get cold in the winter. We're used to having respiratory problems that a lot of times we don't even attribute to the building. And Passive House Standard really kind of addresses all of those things from the health and comfort perspective of the occupant.
Mm. Yeah, and I was remembering one of the numbers that you guys said during the tour that I did of the passive house in Englewood, that the air tightness was 0.3 air changes per hour and code is 3 air changes per hour. And
Close. That project was very tight. The passive house requirement is 0.6 or less. And yes, and code, the most up-to-date code, which is not adopted by every county in the United States and is not adopted by Englewood, in fact, is 3 ACH, so 3.0. So that's a big difference right there.
Right.
And then you look at existing buildings, and you're talking easily 10, 11, 12, up to 15, some of these leaky houses. So a lot of what we are used to kind of comparing in our head is with leaky homes,
Yeah, right, exactly. And I think that is the part where people, when you said we're used to kind of poorly performing homes, that the first thing that people think is, well, do I really want it that tight? And I think maybe that leads to integrative design, because we are definitely not advocating that you go to an existing home and just seal it up and go, good job, because you may just be setting yourself up for condensation problems or for backdrafting water heaters that could kill somebody because of carbon monoxide. So that's why. So do you want to lead into that a little bit about what is integrative design? And I was really amazed, some of the photos that we have in the other video talking about that Englewood house. So definitely check that video out if you want to see some of the pictures. But some of the details were quite amazing and mind blowing, and to think of how that all fits together, and the amount of effort that really takes to make sure that you're not doing one thing that then causes another problem. So, what is integrated design, and how does EMU fit in when you're trying to work with a builder or architects, design teams to come up with a passive house?
Yeah, a couple things real quick that came to mind while you were talking about that, though, that I'd like to address is that passive house can be for retrofit on existing homes, and that's something that's often skipped over. There is a substandard of the International Passive House Standard that's called EnerPHit, and it's specifically to help assess performance metrics in an existing building. And it's to avoid things kind of like what you were talking about. No, you don't want to jump in and, make an existing building airtight without thinking about the mechanical ventilation, because you're ultimately going to have health and comfort issues with that if you do that. And so the EnerPHit standard really kind of helps define an ultimate goal and then break that down into steps of renovation. So that's something interesting for folks to look at. There aren't a ton of EnerPHit projects in the United States, but there are some. We have a pilot builder in Montana that's doing his own house right now, and a couple of others that I can send you some links to look at as case studies. But that was one thing. The other thing is just kind of what you're talking about, the integrative design process. And this is something that comes up a lot more when we're talking about new construction, because you're talking about pulling together an entire team of professionals together to have this same goal. And I think there's a little bit of an intimidation factor, that it sounds like it's going to be incredibly complicated, and it sounds like it's a huge lift. And what I would say is that is probably more accurate in the first project that a project team is doing together. So just for context, our company, we don't work directly with homeowners. We work with their project teams. So we train their builders. We do reports and commissioned modeling for the architects. So we typically are working with the professionals on the team. So when they bring us in, the most important thing is that it is early in the process. And so from a homeowner perspective, the best thing you can do is really early on, define your team, find people you're comfortable with, and make sure that the scopes are defined, roles and responsibilities are defined. I think one of the things that is different in truly high performance projects, and that's changing a lot in the industry, is where the onus, the responsibility lies for the building science part of it. And, in the past, when we were architects, for example, we just had a passion about building science. I will say right now, we put in a lot more work than what we actually charged people for. And that is the case for a lot of professionals that are wanting to go down this path, is that it's something they care deeply about. But as we get more and more developed as an industry towards this, those are roles and responsibilities that can easily be scoped out into the project. So the integrated design project process is great, because from the beginning, you've got those roles really kind of defined. You've got all the people sitting at the table early enough in the process to do the modeling, look at it from a virtual standpoint, see how this project is going to work virtually in modeling before the ground is even broken, so that you're not making mistakes farther down the line. I will say there is a very high correlation between successful passive house builds and builders who run clean and organized construction sites and teams. And that is nothing to do with passive. That's just that passive means that you're building high quality. And if you're building high quality, you've got to have a team that's professional and knows what they're doing with that.
I think that's kind of what Peter was talking about too, is he said as he was starting to give tours for the Englewood passive house, that the builders that have been coming through, the tradespeople that have been coming through, are oriented to high performance in everything they do, and they're like, this just takes it to the next level.
Yeah, and it makes sense. It's a lot of, I think the biggest feedback I get from the builders when they complete the training is not that they can't do it. The perceived leap between high quality building and craftsmanship to passive house is not big. It's a mentality shift. It's about things like sequencing and quality control, and just changing the order of how you would have normally done things so that you can air seal more correctly. And a lot of that is just planning. So it's more planning. You bring everything upstream a little bit more.
Right. It's very cool, because I had a couple experiences. We were the consultant for the Xcel Energy Design Assistance Program back, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. And that was for commercial buildings. And that's kind of what we were doing, was sitting, on that team with the architects and builders, or, maybe owners in some cases, depending how it was for those commercial buildings. And then also at Fort Collins Utilities, there's an integrated design program. So I think this actually leads us into Xcel. But what I wanted to say to everyone is, if you're thinking of doing a high performance home, then definitely reach out to your utility as well as your city and your state energy office, and see if there are rebates and programs available that can help you fund either the consultants or the extra features that you might be putting in there. So yeah, I think we should mention what Xcel Energy is doing regarding the people that were affected by the Marshall fires in Colorado.
Yeah, this is a really important step, and it's kind of an unprecedented level of incentive and rebate going on. And you had just mentioned, that some of that process existed, that integrated process existed when you were looking at commercial. And, I will mention that passive house is for commercial as well. And a lot of times because the commercial process is a little bit more accustomed to that integrative design process, it makes more sense, And so what we're talking about here today is how can, on the residential side of this, how can you take advantage of it? And the incentive program that's been put together by Xcel it's specifically for the victims of the Marshall fire that we had here in Colorado that was so destructive. The folks who are able to rebuild to the passive house standard would qualify for $37,500 rebate from Xcel on that, which is a substantial chunk into your costs. And certainly when you get into the discussion about how much does high quality or high performance construction cost, that can help a lot. I think there's a little bit of an unfortunate disconnect for a lot of the Marshall Fire victims, because they didn't anticipate getting into custom rebuilds. That was not part of their plan. And so it's hard to enter into that mentality. It's a difficult process, whether passive or not.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it makes me think of a lot of things too that I think, yeah, they're really in an unfortunate position that happened overnight, literally,
Yeah.
or less than overnight.
Yeah.
But it also makes me think a lot of the house hacking techniques, which I'm going to be interviewing an author of one of those books. But I think we're getting pushed into a, a mindset and a different reality where maybe you didn't think about having a separate door to your basement so that you could then rent that out.
Mhm.
But now when you're looking at the economics of rebuilding or, coming up with a single family home, you might be thinking that having an extra income stream
Mhm.
might be a good idea. And so that's like one of the few good things is that people, I think, whether it's that instance, which there's nothing good about your home being destroyed by fire, but the affordability and some of these issues, I think, are opening up ideas of how we can share our spaces
Mhm.
and have it more flexible over time. You buy a house because you've got 3 kids, and then they go off to college, and then you could be renting
Well,
that
yeah, I think the
to,
concept of resiliency is changing, right? Like
yes, exactly.
conversation about what is resiliency. So it's not just um, building more durably and having higher quality, which is something that Passive House really addresses, is making sure that you're building a structure that's more resilient
Right.
and allows you to be more resilient for your health and protection from the elements. But it's also the design of those spaces needs to become more resilient, and the way we occupy those spaces. And I think what we're going to end up seeing as new normals hit us is
Mhm.
that the length of time that people are living in their homes is increasing exponentially, and people are digging in a little bit more. And so with that comes more attention on those things. How can I make this more resilient? And for me, again, not to hammer it home, but the Passive standard in my mind is the only way to address long-term health resiliency within your structure, because you can't control climate events, unfortunately. And
Right.
I believe we're going to have more climate
Yeah.
events. Whether or not your home is in the path of a fire, you're definitely going to be dealing with wildfire smoke here in Colorado. That is a definite. And if you look at the homes near the Marshall Fire that were, right on the edge of not being affected directly by flame, you had a lot of people who couldn't go back into their homes immediately because of the smoke damage inside them. And if we were looking more at air sealing and continuous fresh air exchange and filtering our mechanicals and things that Passive House really advocates, then you would be able to get back into your home a lot faster. And so thinking about that in context is also really
Yeah.
important.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, talking about like the how the weather has changed, and I'm going to leave the link to that video of is Denver getting hotter and showing how different it is from when I was a 10-year-old here. But not only is it getting hotter and setting record-breaking temperatures now, but the likelihood that these years right now are amongst the coolest going forward, given the trajectory of a warming planet. So, yeah, things that we're seeing occasionally now are likely to be more so. And I think from a realtor standpoint, we don't really buy, sell homes. Our clients do. We are just advisors. We're consultants, and we have a fiduciary responsibility. So I think it's really important for us to be raising these ideas about resilience, as well as energy bills. And, we talk about title insurance and HOA costs. It'd be great to include the conversation about energy bills and water bills. And is that where you want to spend your money, or do you want to build something else that especially your kids will be happy that you are prioritizing their future. I think it's a big part of why I do what I do. And I'm I'm sure, I mean, I'm really glad that there's folks out there like you doing this as well, Mariana. So if people want to find out more about Passive House, or, maybe it's somebody who's affected by the Marshall Fire, or somebody who wants their builder, or maybe they are a builder, what's the way to get in touch with you, or what kind of courses or services you guys offer?
Yeah, so our website is emupassive.com. And like I said, we offer primarily accredited training and consulting services to professionals. So if you have a project team that you are wanting to get trained, we've had a number of homeowners that send their builders to our class as part of taking them on as their builder. I have some suggestions about kind of how to work that into contracts with builders and with subcontractors and things like that. But that's kind of the most straightforward way that we can help homeowners, is that you connect us with your project team. We have a pilot program in North America for builders who want to license our construction system and go for full certification for Passive House. Either way, the first place we start is with training, because you don't know what you don't know. So you have to start learning. So training's the first thing. On our website, you'll see there's a number of different online options. And then we also travel around the country and do boot camps in various spots. Next week, we'll be doing our quarterly Colorado boot camp here in Fort Collins. We do that every quarter. And it's 5 days of kind of hands-on, in class, in person, building science geekiness for builders. We have had architects come to that as well, but it's really designed for the contractor and the person who is constructing. And then ideally they're working with an architect and a designer that also speak this language. And then for you as a homeowner, or for building owners in general that are kind of looking toward going in this direction, I just, the more education you can get for yourself on this topic, the better. While our education is primarily focused towards the professionals, I do have a very short little YouTube series of kind of basic concepts that we've started. But there are a ton more resources that are way better than mine. But there's one called the Passive House Accelerator. That's an online community. The Passive House Network is a professional association that offers some intro courses. But really just kind of diving into the online communities, following folks on social media that are talking about these things. We post all kinds of stuff to our Instagram and our LinkedIn that are just a good place to start learning the language. Like I said, it's a language that you are learning. It's a language your builder is learning. You all need to be speaking the same language to head down this path.
And the one other thing I wanted to follow up on, so in addition to all the education that you offer and the integrated design, I think the one thing that we didn't mention really earlier was, and Peter talked about it, how the performance testing, how that sets apart Passive House compared to some of the other, you had mentioned some of the other ones are kind of checking different boxes, which it's not to minimize, because if you're doing like a lead whatever, it's very complicated, and it really does push your design team to new heights. But I think the performance testing is something worth mentioning as a differentiating factor, or at least as a factor.
Yeah. And as I mentioned kind of at the beginning, the biggest thing that is different, that is going to throw off your team the first time, is the sequencing, the process of it. It's a lot more, like I said, upstream work. It's a lot more planning. So heavy emphasis on getting the modeling done. Choosing the windows early on can have a huge high impact on, especially here in climate zone 5 and colder into the mountains. But making some of those early decisions based on the modeling before you jump into construction is what sets it apart. And again, it's a performance metric based on the envelope and the indoor air quality. So it's not going to prescribe the types of materials that you can use, or the construction method, or any of that. It's really looking at the volume that you have, the openings that you have, and what kind of solar gains you're getting through what kind of windows you're specifying, and how that's affecting the overall energy efficiency, and then what kind of mechanical ventilation with heat recovery you're using. And so making those decisions early on is kind of the biggest difference in process for builders. And that's why you see such a huge learning leap from a builder's first build to their second build. And Peter talked about that too when we were there. This was his first certified build, and he did a great job with it. But he will be the first to say there's a million things I would do differently next time, right? And so that's encouraged.
Exactly. And I think he also talked about how in going to measure that air change, that tightness, the air tightness,
the blower door test.
Yeah, the blower door test and and smoke tests and different things to figure out, okay, we thought we were going to be at this level, and then we find, oh wait, we've got some tape that wasn't done over here properly.
Yeah, the blower door test is kind of a key moment for most builders when they're doing their first passive house build. It's when you see if all of the air sealing work that you've been doing is accurate or not. And it's kind of a very tangible view of whether or not you've done a good job with that on the craft side. And what he was talking about was we did, for most passive houses, in fact, I would say there's not a passive project that does not do also a preliminary blower door test. So the final blower door test is the one that goes towards your numbers for certification. But as with anything, it's kind of silly to wait until the last moment when everything's closed up and you can't change anything to look and see how you're doing. So most of these projects will do one, if not two, preliminary blower door tests earlier on in the process to kind of use as a diagnostic tool and see, okay, where are leaks that I didn't expect? And then you can fix them before you go to the next phase of construction.
Yeah. And for anybody who's not familiar with a blower door test, I got to get certified in that a while back. And I remember doing it on my parents' home that was built 100 years ago. And it was like, this is craziness. It didn't have enough power. But the general idea is that you close the house up and you put this big fan in the front door and you turn it on and you try to measure the air leakage in a consistent way from one house to the next by pressurizing the house and measuring how quickly the air turns around, and the less air, the more airtight. But yeah, it's a very cool thing. We'll have to do another video on blower door tests because they're so cool. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Mariana. And I guess, we talked about what is a passive house and, the different pillars and the rebates for Marshall fire, people that were affected by that. And, just the idea that you can work, that your builders, your design team can work with somebody that is a pro at this, that can help them sequence and figure out what's all happening. There's probably going to be a learning curve. And, as with, this is important stuff. I know you said people don't necessarily choose it for energy efficiency, but climate, that climate change is huge. And the idea that you could maybe reduce your carbon footprint by 90%, and then you could maybe slap some solar on there to get the rest to, get you to net zero.
One of the things that we didn't really talk about much is just making sure that folks understand that passive house is a streamlined pathway to net zero. They don't conflict with each other. They work with each other very nicely, because if you're conserving before you compensate, you need to compensate a lot less. So, frankly, we are not going to hit our climate goals as a global community if we don't conserve vast amounts of energy and then compensate with renewables. And so this is one pathway to that.
Yeah. And it's great to know, as you mentioned too, that there are versions of the standard for renovations, for renovating homes, for commercial, for new buildings. And yeah, I worked at eSource for a while, which was started by Amory Lovins, and he always talked about negawatts And those are, that's the energy you save before you ever have to produce it. And so if you can make like a 90% improvement and then, figure out the rest with renewables, we're there. So this is really doable. And my whole focus is, yes, climate change is happening. Yes, there's a lot of environmental destruction, but we've figured out a lot of cool things, and we're at a place that the solutions are here. If we bring our creativity and our passion and our enthusiasm, then we can make a big impact at this moment. And thank you to EMU and some of the others out there that are pioneering the way, so we don't have to learn it all from scratch.
I love that. Thank you. Yes, it's a great note to end on, is that this is possible. People are doing it every day, all the time. People are doing it. So, let's all jump on board.
Yeah. And, I in the real estate process, a lot of people don't even bring up energy efficiency or indoor air quality. And so I would just advise you to start asking those questions. And now you've got some words to throw around, and then know that there's people out there that can help you make that all possible. All right. Thank you so much, Mariana, and hope to see everybody soon in the Mile High City. Take care.